All right, I'd like to go ahead and spend a little time talking about some of the variables we look at in profiling and then address some of Chapter 3, looking at some of the assumptions of criminal profiling. If you think about how a profile is constructed, it has many interrelated variables, and we try to paint a picture, if you will, of a suspect or the type of person who possesses certain characteristics that would commit a particular crime. What you're going to find, though, is that some of these variables are not that helpful and in fact may be problematic and create some problems. So it's really important to look at the context of the crime and the analysis of the crime scene and factors related to the behaviors. What we're trying to do is we're trying to understand how the offender thinks, acts, and behaves and feels about his or herself, how the offender interprets the situation where the violence is enacted, how the offender makes sense of his or her self-concept. We are not trying to think or feel like the offender or somehow get inside of their head through some magic hocus pocus type of behavior where we pretend, how would we feel if we were the offender? No, not at all. That, in fact, in my opinion, is setting oneself up for failure and very dangerous. We are not able to get inside offenders' heads, and if we don't commit the specific crimes that the offenders do, then it's very difficult to understand the nature of the feelings, the pleasures, the anxieties, and the drive that go along with committing a crime. And I know sometimes you may see on television the person says, well, I'm going to get inside their head and I'm going to think how they think. I disagree. And for the main reason is that, for example, if one wants to counsel someone who is actively psychotic and work with someone who's actively psychotic, they don't need to have been actively psychotic, and they sure don't need to be currently actively psychotic in that sense. And that would, be troublesome. Now, it may be helpful if the person constructing the profile has experience interviewing and studying these specific types of criminals and criminal behaviors. So I really have a lot of caution with some of these variables. The first two, age and sex. Well, age, I think what we're looking at often is age range. Is this something that a adolescent would most likely do, or middle-aged person, or a young adult? With gender, again, we're basically asking, is the person most likely to be male or female? And there'll be times when we will not be able to determine whether the person is male or female. Race and ethnicity, again, it's not going to be that helpful in that sense, other than we find that many crimes tend to occur with a victim and a perpetrator of similar racial or ethnic background. And again, age, sex, and race may not be real helpful in the long run. And certainly, we've seen cases where, and we'll see later on when we look at the actual profiles in the textbook, where we might say that's more probable, but certainly we need to take into consideration that there's a likelihood that we could be mistaken. Intelligence may tell us a little bit about their cognitive skills to carry out particular crimes, as well as their education. We might be able to understand the type of family that they may have come from or where they live. whether they used a particular mode of transportation, what type of employment they have, their psychosexual development, and what sexual paraphilias they might have. Paraphilias are unusual sexual behaviors or urges or drives or fantasies. Some are violent and some are non-violent, and we'll certainly look at some of the paraphilias later on in the semester, such as pedophilia and sadomasochism. Other paraphilias you may have heard of, for example, are voyeurism, which is watching unsuspecting people either having sex or engaged in undressing or showering for sexual purposes of the perpetrator. And then exhibitionism is exposing one's genitals to unsuspecting people for the perpetrator's sexual arousal. And also we want to look at ideas about how to interview. And I believe that many would say interrogate, which may be the case. And of course, you need to realize there's a big difference between an interrogation versus an interview. And there's a lot of different types of interviews as well. You know, in an interrogation, we're trying to get the person to confess to their criminal activities. Often in an interview, we may or may not have that goal. We may have a goal of just trying to understand their mental health at a particular point, and part of that may include trying to understand the criminal activities or allegations in many cases. So we kind of set this framework for a profile, and we'll see how that materializes throughout the semester for certain types of crimes. Chapter 3, the rationale for psychological profiling, starts really with an overview looking at biology, culture, environment, uncommon experiences, and unique experiences. And so again, we'll address this later on, but what we're going to do is we're going to look at later on in the theory discussion, we're going to look at biological medical factors that may be related to violent behavior, as well as cultural influences in the environment. And we're also going to think about common experiences people share, as well as unique experience that may influence certain types of behaviors. Now, there's some basic assumptions, really 4 basic assumptions, and described by Holmes and Holmes in your textbook, I think are very important to mention. Number 1 is that the crime scene tends to reflect the personality of the perpetrator. What do we mean by this? Well, if we look at a particular crime scene, we begin to understand a little bit about the perpetrator's personalities and characteristics. Are they meticulously clean? Are they messy and chaotic? There's certain features that they leave at the crime scene as indicators of their presence, certain messages they try to convey. You know, what are the different types of violence and levels of violence that are used, and what types of weapons are used, and so on. The second assumption is that the method of operation of committing the crime usually remains relatively stable or similar. And this is helpful. These 2 factors are helpful right away when you start thinking about a very important feature related to serial crimes, and that's linking them. You know, there's 4 crimes that are committed in a community. Is it possible that's the same perpetrator or perpetrators? The signature will remain the same. The signature being all these other things that are not directly related to carrying out the crime, but they may leave particular items, or they may you know, carry out particular behaviors on a victim's body, or you know, they may do something inside of one's apartment or house, and so they often will leave these so-called signatures. And finally, the 4th assumption is the offender will not change his or her personality. And that's important to recognize as well. The personality is relatively stable, other than you know, active psychotic breakdowns, major drug alcohol use, cognitive impairments due to dementia, and cognitive problems due to medical conditions such as tumors or exposure to environmental toxins, the personality will remain relatively stable. We may not see all the components of a person's personality, but their core personality is relatively stable, and we begin to make some assumptions about what type of personality a person would have that carries out particular criminal behaviors. So those are sort of the four major assumptions that are discussed in Chapter 3. So you can see again that the criminal profiling strategies, ideas, assumptions gives you a few clues, but doesn't give you the entire story. And this wraps up this brief video.